Good afternoon, everyone. I am a little soft-spoken, so if you can't hear me in the back, just let's pretend we're all at home and, tell me to holler and tell me to speak up. I want to begin with gratitude. First Lady Hutchinson, that was just a beautiful scientific explanation of the biology of ACEs and really exciting work, and I'm just honored to be here today. I appreciate the planning committee. I appreciate the invitation. But before I forget to say it, I appreciate the people in this room. As all of you know, the work that we're doing and the commitment to this work is very difficult and takes a lot personally from each of us. And if anyone hasn't told you today, let me have the honor of being the person to say that you're special, you are appreciated, your work makes a difference, and just take a look around the room, because you are not alone in this effort, and together we are a large community that can make a difference. And so for me, it's inspiring, the fact that everyone showed up in this room today, and I'm excited to get to learn with you. So, let me start a little bit. I'm going to talk about adverse childhood experiences and its relationship to equity. And I just ask that you trust the process a little bit. So, I'm not trying to sell anything, don't worry. A couple of learning objectives. We're going to talk a little bit about what's already been well covered this morning. So I'll talk very briefly about the impact of community environment on child well-being, what role community-based solutions play in improving well-being and preventing adversities, what are some new and necessary practices, seeing systems and seeing structures, and then review some strategies to really grow civic engagement and involvement in this work. So many of you might have seen this slide already, but if we think about what determines your health, healthcare takes up this teeny slither up here. And that's how I was trained. I was trained to be a medical provider, a pediatrician. I was trained to do public health work and research. But as I realized that what determines your health is this really small slither, it means that there's so much work that no individual sector can do alone, and us working together collaboratively is necessary. The other thing we know from economics, public health research, science, is that early childhood is a particularly important phase of life. Children are particularly vulnerable to their social and environmental experiences because their brain is developing and growing in a more sensitive and responsive to the environment way than it will in the future. So we know you are forming your attachment, which forms the basis for your future social relationships, a big predictor of health. The vulnerability in this period is enhanced by socioeconomic deprivation, material deprivation. So there is a heightened risk to the experience of deprivation during the sensitive period of brain growth and development. We also know that there are huge opportunities in early childhood that we don't see later on. Because of this neuroplasticity, because of this early development, smart social programs, consistent supportive caregiving, opportunity structures within neighborhood that provide enrichment and contribute to the growth, well-being, and quality of families and children have a huge impact. So interventions early on are huge. So children in many ways are the canary in the coal mine. In many ways, they're most sensitive to threats, but in many ways, they also have the greatest capacity for resilience. And as we've heard this morning, adverse childhood experiences have enduring consequences on health and developmental potential throughout the life course. They are not deterministic of what your health or your potential will be, but they have an impact that exists through life. And it's not just individual adverse experiences, it's also adverse social environments, the environment in which children are growing and thriving, learning, playing, and experiencing the world. So when we look at adverse childhood experiences, we see that they contribute a tremendous amount to leading causes of morbidity and mortality and leading risk factors for morbidity and mortality. And, you know, we struggle with seeing and understanding why would it be that adverse experiences in early childhood would contribute to such a range of different health outcomes. You know, the first thing we usually think of is a direct effect. So something bad happens, you see an immediate effect, an immediate impact of that adverse exposure. So there'd be a direct impact that's experienced. The second thing we would think about are indirect effects. So when adversity happens, it affects your social emotional growth, your mental health, your well-being, your readiness to learn in the classroom, affects performance in school, graduation from high school, and affects and contributes to life chances through indirect pathways of cumulative disadvantage. But the most insidious pathway is the one that we really don't see. So I'm up here, if I fall down and break my leg, I can guarantee that everyone close by will come, help me up, get me to a hospital, make sure I get surgery, my leg is set, bandaged, and that I go to physical therapy. They'll make sure that my physical wound is healed. But across this room, we are sitting next to someone who we can tell has a deep emotional wound. Maybe is experiencing major depression, maybe is experiencing major anxiety, maybe is experiencing a major life event. But we're not going to respond in the same way to those emotional wounds as you would to my broken leg with the bone sticking out. We might not say a thing to that person. We won't respond with acute, urgent, responsive therapies. And so that emotional wound may just continue unhealed in an insidious way, but not heal. So over time, that just could become worse or can appear in different ways. We also have to think about neighborhood characteristics of the social environment, opportunity structures within the environment, safety within the environment. And you know, I love this model that Dr. Pinder Hughes has helped to develop with the Prevention Institute, thinking about the environment in multiple dimensions. We often think about the environment as one thing. But if you really think about it, there's the equitable opportunity, there's the actual built physical structure of the place, and then there are the people. And so when we think about community trauma, we have to think about how does community trauma affect opportunity? What happens with intergenerational poverty, chronic divestment in neighborhoods? What happens with deteriorated, unsafe public spaces? No beautiful trees, no beautiful grass to look at. What happens with poor social cohesion, civic engagement, lack of collective capital of the folks living there? So all of these factors are affected by community trauma. If we think of a particular example, you could think of homicides or violence within a neighborhood. We often think they affect children through their direct witnessing of those events. So let's just imagine the children in the neighborhood who didn't witness that event, who didn't hear about it, didn't even know it happened. How might it affect their well-being? So violence affects how people trust each other in a neighborhood. It affects your willingness to get to know your neighbors, social cohesion. Well, how does that affect family dynamics? If you don't really know your neighbors and you don't really trust your neighbors, What does that do in terms of the stress that caregivers feel when they're away from their children? What does that do to the relationship between a parent and a child when a child goes along a street that they're not supposed to go along, where another child their same age was harmed or injured? Does a normal thing that an adolescent would do. What's the degree of response from the parent under these conditions? And then how does that ultimately influence the way the child feels, grows, develops, presents for learning, and can focus on and engage in learning? So these are some of the more insidious ways in which violence and trauma experienced at the community level can truly impact the growth, development, and life chances of children. Not because of a direct exposure, not because of hearing about an exposure, but through the impact it has on social relationships among people and how that shows up in the lives of children. We also have to acknowledge history, historical traumas that have been experienced cumulatively and collectively by communities. What ways in which do those traumas sustain and pass along generations? What are practices and adaptations that groups have developed as a response to that trauma that continue to influence the development and well-being of children over time? So all of this leads us to understanding that an ecological approach is absolutely necessary. First and foremost, trauma symptoms are a response to an environmental condition. So if you cannot reestablish a sense of safety, a sense of security within your environment, all of the best therapies and medicines in the world will not have an optimal impact if a child doesn't feel safe. For educators, for clinicians, for public health providers, for parents, for social service providers, community organizers, none of us corner the market on helping kids feel safe. We have to work together to create safer environments for children. Reestablishing safety and sense of security is the most important foundational step to the healing process. So coordination is required, and because coordination is required, I can no longer let myself off the hook as being the pediatrician who listened to the heart, looked in the throat, swabbed the throat, and said, anticipatory guidance in a room. I had to learn to work with others. So our systems of care are highly siloed, but we know the factors that are protective and supportive for children and for their resilience are overlapping, and that all of our different disciplines are working on the same things. So here's the stretch part. I want to ask you a fundamental question. All of us in this room might feel differently about this question, but answer it honestly for yourself. Can we achieve health equity if we do not have a process that incorporates diverse forms of wisdom? So what I mean by that is if what we imagine in the future is that every child has the same chances, same opportunities to be healthy and live a productive, meaningful, full life, can we really work towards that if we're not working with a diverse group of people? If a diverse group of people aren't participating in answering that question. So some of you may have seen this cartoon before, right? Over here, we have equality. Everyone gets the same. Programs are distributed the same. Everyone gets the exact same access to school environments and resources. We have reality over here, where because of historical trauma, community trauma, violence, interpersonal and otherwise, the reality is we're not starting at a level playing field. Some groups have many more resources than others. And then in the middle we have equity, which means taking into account everything we know about how trauma at the family, community, and historical level can contribute to how children grow and develop, what would we do to give everyone an equal shot at seeing the ball game, an equal shot at participating in life? And this is hard. It means we might have to do different things based on how we understand trauma may have influenced families and communities over time. That's really hard to do from a policy perspective. At the end of the day, the goal would be to not have to deal with the fence at all, right? Our goal would be ultimately not to have any barrier to a child experiencing their fullest potential. And we can't forget that ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what we're striving for. You know, we're striving to work all of ourselves out of a job. So what's the opportunity proposition? Can community-based solutions make a difference? And what are community-based solutions anyway? So here's a definition to share. A community-based solution may be an action or a policy that is driven by community members. Driven by community members. It can affect local factors that can influence health, and it has the potential to increase equity. So when you think about a community-based solution, the capacity to promote well-being and reduce inequities is there. But it's community-driven. It's driven by a collective, by a group. And so here's where we have to look in the mirror. Look at the man in the mirror, the woman in the mirror, or from a child perspective, think about the first time you see a child recognize their image in the mirror, how like cool that is for them, of like, ooh, that's me, right? Well, I want us to kind of hold that mirror up to ourselves as well. What is it that we could be doing differently to really promote a more community-based approach to addressing ACEs and improving equity? And I'd like to spotlight a couple of things and begin with a proposition. Let's say you imagine that communities may have a number of challenges that they're facing, but let's just imagine that instead of seeing the cup half empty, you saw the cup as half full. Imagine that communities have a range and abundance of solutions that are already in place, but we're not recognizing them because we're focusing on the negative. But in the absence of those solutions, things would probably be a lot worse. So let's imagine we tried to kind of put on a spotlight on the successes of families, on the smart strategies that families were already coming up with, the smart things that were already happening in communities, the creative things that were already there. Would we approach communities with interventions in the same way if we were already expecting to find solutions were there? So that simple change in frame from identifying problems and deficits that we work to correct to expecting to see solutions that we want to uplift and grow and scale and spread is exactly how we approach the concept of community resilience. So we really think about how do we cultivate the capacity of the community to drive their own solutions, and we begin with the idea that solutions are already there, that we don't have to bring new solutions in. We have to recognize the solutions that exist. So this begins with us thinking a little bit about what resilience is to begin with. We've talked about it today. It's a part of the title of today. But what do we really think resilience is? Take a moment. I bet across this room, we all actually have a pretty different concept of where resilience comes from. Is it something that you can grow? Is it something that you can build? Or is it something that you're just kind of born with? So when we think about resilience, we have a lot of mythology about resilience. This is a statue of Paul Bunyan. Maybe some of you know the story. Paul Bunyan, he beat out the machine, right? What happened at the end of the other side of the mountain? He died of a heart attack, right? So severe adversity. He triumphed through grit, but suffered the consequences at the end. So we have a whole mythology in our society around resilience as an individual characteristic, individual powering through. I want us to think about a couple dimensions of resilience. Let's not think about it as one thing. Let's think about it as three things. Your ability to withstand an adversity, your ability to recover from an adversity, and your ability to adapt to a situation of chronic, unrelenting, ongoing adversity. So what if we thought about those three different ways in which resilience could show up? So withstanding is kind of the Paul Bunyan story. If I can make it here, I can make it anywhere, right? So this is really focused around surviving and thriving and gritting your way through, right? But there are community factors that support that. Your social support system, assets within the community. When we think about the ability to recover from an adversity, what role does the community or the neighborhood you live in play in your recovery? What role does it play? So you need a neighborhood full of opportunities, full of resources, full of caregivers that are tuned in to what adversities look like in school, what adversities look like in learning, how adversities show up in behavior. Because if you have that community, well-informed, knowledgeable, and the resources there, a child can be supported through their recovery consistently. So that makes a lot of difference. The ability to advocate for children, to explain the science of adversity, the ability to understand how trauma shows up, the ability for many community members to be leaders in this, to have a voice in this, to be able to speak with authority about what we understand about the science of adversities. So this really requires that we coordinate and align our efforts in a different way. We have to tap into a different type of potential. And then when we think about adaptation, this is really getting us to that North Star vision. This is really addressing the systems level barriers. So for many of the patients I work with, we have a housing crisis in Boston where I work. And for many of the children that are born in the hospital I work at, about a third of them go to insecure, unstable, or homeless shelter at the time that they're born. And for a majority of those children, housing insecurity is not going to go away in the first 18 years of their life. This is going to be a chronic, enduring, daily stressor for families. So we have to really begin to talk about that in terms of its impact on development and potential of children in a different way, so we can address those systemic barriers. This really also involves thinking about healing spaces and how to leverage social and political capital differently using the science of ACEs. So what we did locally was started to reorient our focus based on understanding the science of ACEs, and we developed something called Vital Village, which is just a network. It's a network. It's a place for people to collaborate, to convene, where parents and caregivers can work alongside practitioners, educators, social service providers. It's a simple idea that could we create a table for constant engagement, shared accountability, and shared collaborative efforts. And if that table existed, would more collaboration grow from that? And we do two things. We focus on building community capacity to address ACEs and promote well-being, but we do that in a pretty particular way. We take the understanding of ACEs, the understanding of trauma, community trauma, historical trauma, and interpersonal trauma, and how that affects health, to bring in a whole range of non-traditional partners. People to the table who don't define their work as violence prevention, don't define their work as addressing trauma, don't define their work in this way. But through the trauma-informed lens, they can see how if absenteeism at school is an issue that they care about, well, what is the contribution of community trauma and family trauma to student absenteeism? So using that lens, we can create much richer, deeper, and more well-formed and long-lasting partnerships. So can you engage a broader community in supporting a shared aim? And I want to talk about 4 things we've done to support this. And the first thing was really the network, which we call a community of practice. So we lead by listening with the understanding and appreciation that solutions already exist, and our job is to highlight them, spotlight them, and elevate them. So that is a critical assumption that dramatically changes the posture by which we engage in partnerships with communities. We catalyzed collaboration, so we think of a lot of ways, no way too small, for people to work together around an existing effort or to bring their work into it, bring non-traditional partners to the table. And then we think about many strategies for collective actions. How can people become civically engaged and a part of this work from exactly where they are, creating a bounty of opportunities. And a lot of this has already been reviewed today, thinking about the geographic area, thinking about not just investment in community, but investment by members of the community, translating knowledge into practice. These are common things. To give a really specific example, because I speak around the country a lot, and there are a lot of coalitions that are working together. And one thing that I find that we all have in common is sometimes we get tired. There's a lot of fatigue in this work because there's a lot of planning and strategizing and energy building and momentum building. And it's hard to see change. And it's hard to sustain that momentum. Conflicts sometimes arise. People come and go. So it's really hard to get started. And one of the things we did was a hub of innovation, which actually begins with a very small group of partners. Perhaps one local library works with one laundromat and maybe one social service provider on growing an existing program in a different way. So non-traditional partnerships, thinking about the communities that they're serving and how they overlap, and what are ways they can leverage resources together and create space for community members to lead. So these hubs of innovation became our biggest secret weapon. What we've learned is even when giving some of the innovation hubs small grants, we don't see more outcome based on the size or the amount of grants. It's really more about the balance of needs and the mutuality of relationships among the partners and the degree to which community members are really welcomed as true partners to lead and drive the work. So these hubs of innovation have scaled and spread in different ways, and I'll share 1 or 2 examples later. The second thing we've worked on is a concept my colleague at NYU, Helena Hansel, calls structural competency. So it's not a typo. I know many people in the room have heard the term cultural competency. This is structural competency, and I want to share an example to help us think about it. It's taking something that we look at and we see as cultural and talking about the structural features of it. So, when was this picture taken? Does anybody know? Dust Bowl, right? Great Depression, Dust Bowl. Can folks just call out what emotion you see in this picture? What emotions do you see? Stress, despair, anguish. People might say maternal depression. People might say family resilience, determination, despair, depression. When we look at this picture, we see all of those things, but we also place it historically. Dust Bowl, Great Depression. And when we think about this family, we think about the impact of the Great Depression on this mother, her children, and the quality of life for this family. So now think about the last time you interacted with a family member who may have been depressed, a family in your clinic or your school that may have been experiencing hard times. Did you think about the greater economic, political, socio-political climate that they're operating within, and how it might be influencing what you're seeing and attributing to that family, putting on their shoulders, right? So this is part of seeing structure. It's making the invisible visible, and it's a practice. So I want to share an example. This is a picture from like the aquarium. I love going to the aquarium. I just love seeing like that big tortoise, these big fish floating around, and you're just like, wow, this is just like what it must be like at the bottom of the ocean. They're just swimming freely. And then you notice that there's a glass, right? Huge, thick glass. So it's really a ginormous fishbowl. And in fact, the fish are not just swimming freely. Their pattern of swimming is determined by where that glass is. So they just aren't going wherever they want to do and just living their lives however they want. They're actually swimming within a contained structure that dictates the patterns of their movements every day. But when we see people, we don't see the structure, right? So I think about that invisible glass. And I think about what happens when you recognize that that glass exists. What does it make you think differently about when you think about a strategy for supporting and uplifting that family or improving the well-being for that child? So this is a practice. You have to practice seeing what is not visible. What's the container that people are operating within? And if you can practice this more often and in every situation, and if we can practice this within our coalitions, we get very good at seeing ways in which social structure can create unhealthy options for families, and starting to identify what would be the social policy changes that would really help prevent future adversities, that would really help promote healing after adversity. We start to think about a whole range of other things that aren't really on the shoulders of the families, but maybe on the shoulders of the broader community and policy structure. So it makes us think a little differently. You know, we know it's important to invest early in educators and young children and caregivers. We know that this investment is important. We know that we're supposed to use a strengths-based approach. We're supposed to engage families. We're supposed to try to have a comprehensive way of capturing the strengths, assets, as well as challenges families are facing. But often we're doing this in a siloed way. If you think about early childhood, who are we often missing in the equation when we're thinking about children and their well-being? Dads. We're often missing fathers. We have a whole field of public health, maternal and child health. We have a whole prenatal care process, really important, that screens moms not just for their health, but for maternal depression, right? Screens them for a variety of things. Where's the parallel process for dads to be? Is their mental health important? And where is the process within our system for providing that appropriate preventive prenatal care prior to the birth of a child for a father? Where is that? So often we see dads as absent, neglectful, not being there. But let's take on our trauma-informed lens. What would explain absenteeism? What would explain lack of engagement? Do we see confusion? Do we see hurt? Do we see vulnerability? Have we considered what a trigger it might be if you had a difficult relationship with your father preparing for the birth of your first child? Would it be so impossible for us to establish a parallel system of care for dads to be similar to what we do during prenatal care to really maximize their social relationships and mental and social well-being as they're preparing for the birth of their child? So something simple, but something that we're just not doing. And we kind of have to begin to wonder why. The thing we think about really is sustainable leadership and development. And when we think about parent leadership, it's commonly in the form of like an advisory group or board, which isn't a bad idea. But just think about it. Think about it as a much more complicated thing. What would be the environmental factors that would promote leadership of parents? What would be inviting? What would be welcoming? What would be the fertile soil of parent leadership? What are the things that you don't see that would encourage and welcome leadership? And if those things aren't there, what might it be that we're not welcoming or afraid of? Why might it be that we're not truly cultivating leadership of parents? Are we concerned that their wisdom doesn't match our evidence base? Are we concerned that we might not be able to do a program that we believe heavily in if we have to incorporate other opinions and voices? So getting to understand what's happening there. So one of our hubs of innovation was a baby cafe model where we really brought together a lot of non-traditional partners. One aspect of it is supporting breastfeeding. Another aspect of it is supporting early attachment. Another aspect of it is just social relationships and appreciating and acknowledging how isolating it can be right at the time you have a newborn infant. Few places you can go, few people you can see. And we really scaled this model to 10 sites rapidly across the city of Boston with no funding. Our funding was the political capital and will of community members that wanted to build their skills in this area, wanted to volunteer their time, and wanted to lean into this process. So it was all powered by community members. Well, parents of small children often are really busy and have a lot else going on. But these are mission-driven folks who want the opportunity to make the experience for new parents to be better than the experience that they might have had. They have a social justice orientation. They have an equal desire to learn from other parents as they do to educate other parents, which differs from my role. Usually when I'm in pediatrics, I'm in high education mode. I'm not as good at listening and learning from families. They're much better at that, and that leads to much longer engagement. They're interested in empowerment, service, and improving their community. So parent leadership is very important, but we have to be respectful of some of the things we've talked about around trauma. We have to have an understanding of intergenerational trauma and how that shows up. So if you as a parent had a horrible experience in school, you were told you weren't smart, you were told you were bad, you were told you weren't good at school, what must it feel like to get called to the principal's office to talk about your child? So sometimes we have to truly understand where behaviors come from for parents and the impact of intergenerational trauma on their abilities to engage in processes that are set up in ways that might disadvantage them from the beginning. So are there ways that parents can have successful and positive experiences at school before a negative experience, right? So we want to think about that. We also want to think about it as a two-way street. We often think about children as developing. We don't think about parents as developing. Now that I have a 15-year-old, I see myself in a very developmental stage. But parents are also developing in their skills to be parents. And we have to think about that and accommodate that in community leadership processes as well. So here's the second stretch piece. We talked a little bit about equity. We talked a little bit about seeing systems, right? Seeing structures. So I want, every time you see an iceberg, I want you to think systems thinking, right? So often what we see is just the tip of the iceberg, right? So when we think about ACEs and how we measure them and how we screen for them and how we capture them, we're capturing a series of events. That's a good start, but that is the tip of the iceberg, right? So if we see screening and capturing ACEs as the whole solution, just identifying the events, we're really missing everything under the surface. So then we have to begin to think about what's just at the water level and just below the level. What are the patterns? Why is it that some children are at risk for more ACEs than others? Why is it that some communities are experiencing a disproportionate burden of ACEs than others? We can't stop at the tip of the iceberg. We have to begin to think about those patterns, try to understand those patterns. And then we have to think about what are the structures that are leading to those patterns. Chronic underemployment, substance abuse, other factors in the community that might be contributing to the patterns that we're seeing. But we can't stop there. What is leading to those structures? And here's where it gets a little hard. Mental models. Well, what does that mean? It means our ways of seeing the world, right? Why does things work this way? Those mental models, our cultural norms, our cultural values, create our policies and systems. So our policies and systems are reflective of things that we find culturally valuable. So if we think about ACEs as the tip of the iceberg, if we really want to prevent ACEs, we have a lot of work to do under here, a lot of work under the surface. So there are a couple of ways that we do that. Sorry, am I not being loud enough? Thank you. So I'll talk a little bit about a fun tool that we use, and it's human-centered design, and it essentially allows all of us to experience a little bit of kindergarten, to be playful and innovative in our thinking so that we can think in different ways. So we use community engagement strategies, we use quality improvement, and we use leadership models. And one of the things we do is called a 90-day challenge. There's nothing magic about 90 days, but in general, when you're working on a really big vision, really ambitious goal, one of the hardest things to do is figure out, well, what do I do first? And then what do I do next? And how do I hold myself accountable? So we just help folks break down that big vision into smaller, accessible chunks of time. It creates a sense of shared accountability, because once you've written down and shared with your neighbor what you're going to plan to do over the next 90 days, and they shared with you, you're kind of both mutually accountable. You've put it out there. You've put it out there. It creates transparency. Okay, maybe I'm not going to meet this goal, but at least I've set a goal. It creates a collective identity. You know what? Because most people don't meet their 90-day challenge goals in the exact way that they thought they would, but they're in it together. So it reduces that sense of isolation. We are often made to feel very small in our goals, particularly in the early childhood realm. We live in a society where we don't pay educators very highly, we don't invest very highly in early childhood, and we've been taught things like preschool and childcare were like, Play-Doh and crayons, when it's like the most significant period of brain development and growth you will ever experience in your life. So none of our policies match what we understand about science. Public education starts most states at kindergarten, but not all. When are the biggest years of brain development? Before, right? 0 to 3, 0 to 5. So before you get to what every child gets access to, that's a mismatch between our policy and what we understand about the science. Just simply not having that opportunity available to every child seems to miss a critical window. So a lot of this is really about just creating a space where people feel comfortable, really starting to strategically map out their goals and leaning on other members of the community in that way. And a lot of this is about changing your mindset. As an academic, I was told you never share results or findings until they're perfect. You don't even talk about what you're planning to do until it's perfect. You have to get into a space where you're comfortable with failing forward. If you can learn from a failure and share that with others, other people don't have to repeat that same mistake. It creates a whole culture where we're actually sharing critically valuable learned information instead of just pretending everything is successful. Failure's been such a great teacher, and I think being in a mindset where sometimes things will not work as you planned, but you're going to learn something from it anyway, is really helpful. It also brings more people into what we call evaluation thinking. Often when you think of evaluation or measurement, you think of a special group of people that's going to kind of come in, let you know if your program is meeting its milestones or not. Kind of throw that out the window. Everyone has the right to decide what questions are important. Everyone can measure with a pad and a pen if things are getting better. We don't need the fanciest tools, but everyone can begin to lean into measurement from right where they are, and it doesn't matter if it's a perfect measure. So that's been very, very empowering, that members of the community can actually take on responsibility for evaluating, was that event successful? Did it accomplish what we were intending to do? Okay, now we're gonna ask, is this subcommittee functioning in a special way? Now we're gonna ask, are these outcomes where we wanted them to be? So it builds this stairway to bigger evaluation, and that's been very empowering. So the third thing I want to talk about is community capacity and change. And I'll talk about this in one or two ways, but there are many dimensions to whether or not a community is ready to take on the initiative you're working on. So we wanted to reduce adversity and promote well-being through this network. And we worked in 3 neighborhoods in Boston. And we assessed in each neighborhood using this qualitative readiness tool the extent to which those communities were really ready. Was the leadership ready? Was there good knowledge about adversities? Was there good resources? How were people being involved? And you can actually see this as moving along stages. So when we looked at readiness to prevent child abuse and neglect, where we started is in the green, and where we ended last year is in the red. So we actually saw some improvement over time in knowledge, in resources. We looked at this around child well-being as well, and we saw some improvements. Actually, in this neighborhood, we saw an improvement in efforts around child abuse and neglect prevention, but not much improvement in leadership, not much change in community climate, some improvement in knowledge of issues. So then this assessment became really helpful for us to know what was working about what we were doing collectively and what wasn't, and maybe why some communities experience more success than others. We also look at social networks. So this is where we started in the beginning. How are our partners working together? And this was where we were last summer. How much more well integrated are different sectors? Are more sectors working across each sector? So this was a really good measure for us to see, are we accomplishing our goal? Then we wanted to look at the extent to which people collaborate a lot. This is where we were and this is where we are now. So we're seeing more collaborations, more intentional collaborations, stronger collaborations over time. So it's important to follow these things. And then the final thing I want to share about is shared data. Now, data was a hot button issue for us. We had this dream that we could pool a lot of existing data, police data, educator data, health data, all of the protective child services data, pool all these existing resources of data and map it. And take a look at what these neighborhoods look like in these multiple dimensions of data. Well, the problem is we have a lot more negative data than we do have data about assets and resources and values in communities. So it becomes a hot button issue because there's a lot that's not being measured that's happening in communities that's really, really good. But we put it out there, and we started, and we set up an online dashboard. You can see some of it if you go to our website. And we started to take a look at a couple of things that we really cared about. So we used a measure that you can have access to called the Child Opportunity Index. It's created by the Kirwan Institute out of Ohio State, and diversitydatakids.org has mapped it to many major cities across the country. So we utilize that index to look at a number of different opportunities on a scale, relative scale. Which areas of the community were thriving? Which areas in the community were having a hard time? So really high opportunities are in the red, which are kind of surrounding our city of Boston, and really low opportunities are in the dark blue, which are right in the center of our city. So we started to look at the relationship between opportunity and participation in early childhood education. So we see low participation in areas with lower opportunity, but we didn't stop there. We kept going. Residents wanted more useful tools, so we mapped the food pantries, fruit and vegetable markets, and then we started to look at the relationship between household income and the distribution of these markets. So you can see in some areas in the city with really high levels of poverty do not have fruit and farmers markets available. Right? And so we could spotlight this, we could bring it to policy members, point it out, but it also allowed us to see bright spots. There were some neighborhoods with high levels of poverty that had a lot of resources. So we could go to those communities and find out what were you doing that was successful? How did this happen? How did this come to be? Remember that solutions orientation thinking? Started to use the data to help us find solutions and then ask communities and learn about their solutions. So that was really a different way of approaching it. Residents also came up with a whole variety of things we never would have thought of. So we thought, okay, food pantries, let's map where they are, blah, that's great, and then people will have access to resources. Oh no, I live in a neighborhood with really high rates of diabetes, and the food pantry only gives out starches and breads. No fresh fruits, no vegetables. It's not actually very helpful if you have a diabetic diet you have to maintain. We'd like to provide feedback. We'd like to talk about adequacy, accessibility, accuracy, appropriateness, availability, and awareness of these resources so that they can get better. So then this became an advocacy tool. So we have an app, and when someone visits a farmer's market or food pantry, they can leave a rating. And then we feed that back to those sites so that they can improve or they can share resources with other sites. So it provides a way to talk back. We don't just use hard data, we use stories. Data only explains so much in numbers, but people's stories are really important. So we include a lot of storytelling. We include photos and photo voice as part of this as well. So putting it all together, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And I think for many of us, we continue to try the same things over, very hopeful because it's evidence-based, because it's what we were taught to do, or because it's what's common and what everyone else is doing, what we're supposed to be doing. We have to really start to think about that. What are some of the places where we need to stretch and be innovative and stand out and be different and take a risk. So when we think about that iceberg, the systems thinking, you can only react to events. So we can capture events, we can understand that ACEs exist, we can capture it, we can measure it, but we can only react if we're only working at that level. When you start to look at patterns, then you can anticipate. You can start to think, okay, if we're anticipating that next year, based on this pattern, this is what's going to happen, what should we do differently? How should we pivot? How do we orient our work? When you're starting to think about the underlying structures, you start to think about, well, could we design a better system? How do we design a trauma-sensitive school? How do we create a neighborhood environment with healing spaces for children? And then when we think about those mental models, we start to think about, well, what would it take for us to really be invested in early childhood and the potential and promise of every child collectively in a different way? What would we all have to value? What would we all have to believe, and how would we have to follow those values with our policies if we were truly invested in the success of every child? So this can be really helpful for really diving in deeper and seeing actually there's a lot more we could be doing. There's a lot more we could be leveraging of the powerful network in the room. So I'll close with a couple of thoughts. We have to begin to think about unequal allocation of resources and how that contributes to adversities. We have to begin to that discussion. It's a sensitive place, it's a difficult place. We all have different feelings about that place. Pay attention to how you're feeling about those discussions, but don't just shut them out. We have to think about structural inequities and how those contribute to patterns of risk and exposure to risk. And then finally, we have to think about the way in which community trauma and adverse environments affects the social fabric and how that affects individuals so we can respond with appropriate policies. There is a lot of abundance. When you use a trauma-informed lens, you can bring in so many non-traditional partners. And when you use a solution-seeking orientation, you get so many more partners at the table. When we're thinking about strategic focus on key aspects of community capacity building, how do we mobilize more stakeholders? How do we grow civic engagement? How do we communicate with policy audiences? Those are the capacities you strive to build on. And then when we think about service, learning, and leadership, when we think about leadership for members of the community and when we think about our own leadership, think about it in a developmental way. We don't just arrive at the table as leaders. We need to develop, we need time to grow, and we need to be supported in that process. You know, the sum is greater than the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and I truly have seen the value of that in this work. I believe it's really important, but it's very difficult, and it really requires establishing relationships, trust, and strong communication. But I thank you all so much for your time. It's been an honor to be with you today. Thank you.
Okay, so we have time for just a couple of questions for Dr. Boynton-Jarrett. So raise your hand if you've got it, if you have a question, and I'll run the mic to you. Really? She told you everything you needed to know? Okay. I knew I can count on you, Sherry Jo.
I was interested in the geomapping that you were showing. Can you tell me a little bit about the data sources that you used for that geomapping, and then who did that for you? Who did the geomapping, and was there sort of a cost involved with that?
Thank you so much. It's a great question. So we use ArcGIS Online, and that can be free at the basic level if you have data that can be publicly shared. So it really depends on how private or secure the data needs to be. Due to public information, you can access information from the police department. It just takes a long time and a lot of persistence. Similar with school data as well, and even similar with some of the childcare data, we've used creative resources. So we look at places that have childcare licenses, and then we look and see, are they graded on the quality index or scale. So we try to use a lot of publicly available data. And then for mapping it, we've had one member of our team who's helped with a lot of the data analysis and mapping, but we've also had a number of students that have helped. The app I showed you actually was created mainly by a 16-year-old, great coder who, just a kid over the summer. So I just think there are a lot of folks and resources in the community that are willing to volunteer time in a variety of ways. Our mapping is informed by a data work group that's composed of community members. So we're really respectful of transportation costs, of dinner time, of childcare needs. So we really try to build all of that in to creating opportunities for people to participate in it without it coming at a cost to their family's well-being or their personal well-being. But yeah, great questions.
Okay, one more question. Anybody?
How do you promote the app?
How do you promote the app?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, we just released the app 2 months ago, maybe. It's on the App Store. We're still getting it adapted into an Android version, but mainly it's just by word of mouth from the community members, sharing it with each other, yeah, and letting people know about it. And, yeah, but we don't have like a marketing scheme, but there's a website for it to explain how to use it.